Random House Audio presents The Tudors, the complete story of England's most notorious dynasty, by G.J. Meyer. This is Robin Sachs. Introduction. The Tudors ruled England for only 3 generations, an almost pathetically brief span of time in comparison with other dynasties before and since. During the 118 years of Tudor rule, England was a less weighty factor in European politics than it had been earlier, and nothing like the world power it would later become. Of the 5 Tudors who occupied the throne, 3 kings followed by the first 2 women ever to be queens of England by right of inheritance rather than marriage. One was an epically tragic figure in the fullest Aristotelian sense. 2 reigned only briefly and came to miserable ends, and the last and longest lived devoted her life and her reign and the resources of her kingdom to no loftier objective than her own survival. Theirs was, by most measures, a melancholy story. It is impossible not to suspect that even the founder of the dynasty, the only Tudor whose reign was both long and mostly peaceful, and did not divide the people of England against themselves, all of which helps to explain why he is forgotten today, would have been appalled to see where his descendants took his kingdom, and how their story ended. And yet, more than 4 centuries after the Tudors became extinct, one of them is the most famous king, and another the most famous queen in the history not only of England, but of Europe, and probably the world. They have become not merely famous, but posthumous stars in the 21st century firmament of celebrity. On the big and little screens and in popular fiction, their names have become synonymous with greatness, with glory. This is not the fate one might have expected for a pair whose characters were dominated by cold and ruthless egotism, whose careers were studded with acts of atrocious cruelty and false dealing, and who were never more than stonily indifferent to the well-being of the people they ruled. It takes some explaining. At least as remarkable as the endlessly growing celebrity of the Tudors is the extent to which, after so many centuries, they remain controversial among scholars. Here, too, the reasons are many and complex. They begin with the fact that the dynasty's pivotal figure, Henry VIII, really did change history to an extent rivaled by few other monarchs, and that appraisals of his reign were long entangled in questions of religious belief. It matters also that both Henry and his daughter Elizabeth were not just rulers, but consummate performers, masters of political propaganda and political theatre. They created, and spent their lives hiding inside, fictional versions of themselves that never bore more than a severely limited relation to reality, but were nevertheless successfully imprinted on the collective imagination of their own time. These invented personas have endured into the modern world, not only because of their inherent appeal. It is hard to resist the image of bluff King Hal, of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, but even more because of their political usefulness across the generations. Henry, in the process of forcing upon England a revolution from above that few of its people welcomed, created a new elite that his radical redistribution of the national wealth made so rich and powerful so quickly that within a few generations it would prove capable of overthrowing the crown itself. No longer needing or willing to tolerate a monarchy as overbearing as the Tudors had been at their zenith, that new elite nevertheless continued to need the idea of the Tudors, of the wonders of the Tudor Revolution, in order to justify its own privileged position. It needed to make the mass of English men and women see the Tudor century as the supreme forward leap in England's history, a sweeping away of the dark legacy of the Middle Ages. This whole Whig view of history requires a smug certainty that the medieval world was a cesspit of superstition and repression. It demanded agreement that the Tudors had put England on the high road to greatness, and that to say otherwise was to be not only extravagantly foolish or dishonest, but actually unfit for participation in public life. Centuries of relentless indoctrination and denial ensued, with the result that England turned into a rather curious phenomenon, a great nation actively contemptuous of much of its own history. One still sees the evidence almost whenever British television attempts to deal with pre-Tudor and Tudor history. It was not until the second half of the 20th century, really, that historians of some eminence in England and the United States began, often slowly and grudgingly, to acknowledge that the established view of the Tudor era was essentially mythological and could never be reconciled with a dispassionate examination of the facts. Not until even more recently was the old propaganda pretty much abandoned as indefensible. Tudor history remains controversial because, quite extraordinarily for a subject now half a millennium old, its meaning is still being settled. The truth is still being cleared of centuries of systematic denial. With the Academy still bringing 16th century England into focus, we should not be surprised that much of the reading public and virtually the entire entertainment industry remain in the thrall of Tudors who never existed. Whether this will ever change, whether the cartoon versions of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I that now shine in the celebrity heavens alongside James Dean and the Incredible Hulk will ever give way to something with a better connection to reality, is anybody's guess. Perhaps such a change is no longer possible. It is certainly not going to happen as a consequence of this book. I do entertain the more modest hope, however, that a single volume aimed at introducing the entire dynasty to a general readership might prove useful in two ways. By helping to show that the true story of the Tudors is much richer and more fascinating than the fantasy version, and by showing also that the whole story is vastly greater than the sum of its parts. That it contains depths and dimensions that cannot be brought to light by focusing exclusively on Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, or any other single member of the family. That if it is as deeply tragic as I believe it to be, as I hope I have shown it to be, the extent of the tragedy can become clear only when the 5 reigns are joined together in a narrative arc that begins with Henry VII building a great legacy out of almost nothing, moves on to his son's extravagant abuse of a magnificent inheritance, and follows the son's 3 children as, one after another, and in their joltingly different ways, they attempt to cope with what their father had wrought. If a writer should have an excuse for adding to the endless stream of Tudor literature, I therefore offer these: that not enough has been done to deal with the Tudor dynasty as a continuum, a unity, and that popular perceptions of the family have fallen so far behind scholarly understanding that it is necessary to try, at least, to narrow the gap. I disavow any claim to competing with, never mind replacing, the many splendid biographies of the Tudor monarchs and their spouses, agents, and victims that have appeared over the last half-century or so. To the contrary, I have drawn heavily on many such works in assembling the facts with which to weave my story, and I am not merely in their debt, but could scarcely have even begun without them. And I am mindful that my approach carries a price. Dealing with 5 reigns obviously makes it impossible to provide the depth of detail available in, to cite just one distinguished example, J.J. Scarisbrick's magisterial Henry VIII. But it seems fair to question whether so much detail is necessary, or even desirable, in a work aimed at a general readership, and in any case foregoing it brings a gain too. The story of the whole dynasty is not only bigger in obvious ways than any biography, encompassing more personalities, more drama, more astoundingly grand and ugly events, but also, if paradoxically, deeper in one not insignificant sense. The story of any one Tudor becomes fully rounded only when set in the context of what had come before and what followed, with causes and effects sketched in. Not being a work of scholarship in anything like a strict and academic sense, not the fruit of deep tunneling into original source materials, this book is not intended for professional Tudor scholars. I can only express my gratitude to the members of that community, most of whom will be familiar with my facts and my arguments, and some of whom, any still attached to the old conception of the Tudors as builders of England's glory certainly, are likely to reject my conclusions. In any case, those conclusions, based on years of reading and reflection.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?